Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.
Did you ever want to forget anything? Did you ever want to cut away a piece of your memory or blot it out?
I can't believe that you're in love with me.
I hate the thought of being so far away from you, but we'll be together again someday.
I'm on your mind each place you go.
I was tussling with the most dangerous animal in the world, a woman.
Hey, you! Come on if you want to ride.
What's your name?
You can call me Vera if you like. There's a folding bed behind this door. You know how to work it?
I just can't imagine that you love me.
Just remember who's boss around here. If you shut up and don't give me any arguments, you'll have nothing to worry about.
I'm the lucky one. I can't believe.
Even if you did tell the cops I was in on it with you, what could they do to me?
Give a lift to a tomato, you expect it to be nice, don't you?
Welcome to the Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me is Mr. Rob St. Mary.
Not much of a talker, are you?
We're also joined once again this week by Noir Gadfly Richard Edwards.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're continuing to get noir in November with the 1945 film from Edgar-g-ulmer, Detour. Now, this one is almost 70 years old, and it's available for free via archive.org. You can find it on YouTube and many other places, so we will be getting into spoiler territory on this episode. If you haven't seen Detour and don't want anything to be ruined, turn this podcast off now, go watch the film, and come back. We'll still be here. Detour is the story of Al Roberts, a down-on-his-luck guy who's thumbing his way from New York to Los Angeles for a reunion with his gal, Sue. Along the way, he thumbs a ride with the wrong guy and runs across the wrong gal, that Spitfire Vera. The film was shot in less than 2 weeks on a shoestring budget. Why is this cheap little Poverty Row thriller that doesn't even run for 70 minutes and is nearly 70 years old is still being talked about today? I hope we can answer that question before this episode is through. So, Rich, I have a question for you. When did you first see Detour, and what did you think?
Well, it's a great question. I don't actually remember the first time I actually saw it. I think part of it has been that when I was in film school, I actually never saw a copy of this film projected because of the difficulty of securing a clean 35 millimeter master. So it would have been on one of those DVD box sets where Detour was just one of 40 public domain films all thrown together. And I had to, just because I own about 10 different box sets like that in my collection, I just would have stumbled across it as like film number 8 on DVD number 3. And I remember just sitting back that it just didn't feel like any of the other films that were on those DVDs. It really, from the first time I ever saw it, it stood out even before I really had a lot of background about the film.
I had heard of the film. I was familiar with it. I believe there was a documentary I had seen years ago that Martin Scorsese did where he highlighted certain films that he liked. And I remember this was one of them, and the other Ulmer film was The Black Cat with Bela Lugosi and Karloff. And I hadn't seen it before now, and watched it for the show, and also watched the reimagining of it as well for the episode. And I have to say that even though, as you said, it's almost 70 years old, it still really holds up really well, keeps your attention, and I think it has to be in the list of, real classic sort of noir films, and especially with that ending.
I saw this one in either 93 or 94 in like COM 411 or something like that. And my teacher in that one didn't show a whole lot of movies. She was more about television and how media does this, that, and the other thing. I remember she played Personal Best of all films, so that's the only time I've ever seen Personal Best, but she also played Detour, and I was blown away. I mean, this little movie has stuck with me for all these years, and there were lines and scenes. I almost felt like I didn't need to rewatch this movie just because it had kind of seared itself into my brain. And it felt very surreal when I was watching it the first time. There were certain things that happen in it where I'm like, did that just happen? Am I seeing what I'm supposed to be seeing? And I almost appreciated the distance of memory to further obfuscate those things and make them seem even more dreamlike and more distant. Rewatching this again recently, I was like, yep, that's exactly what I remember, and it's just as strange today as it was when I watched it all those years ago. So let's get into it a little bit. We start with a typical film noir fashion. We are in the present and go into the past. In this one, the present is tom-neal sitting in a diner and listening to some music. We've got some diner patrons there who are kind of snappy talking, and at one point one of the patrons puts on the song that casts him immediately back to where he was when he used to play this song. He's a musician, and we start to get his voiceover. So we've got both the flashback and the voiceover, which are great noir conventions, and get to hear him talking about the old days when it was him playing piano with some really quick jazz hands, and with his best gal Sue in this New York club, the Break of Dawn Club. And man, it just we don't waste very much time before we get right into the meat of the story. Well,
there's not a lot of time that's ever wasted in the 67-minute film. And I think what is great about the opening of this film is that Ulmer really infuses that opening scene, if you pay attention to it closely, with just really unexpected artistry. While if people read about this film online or in various books, they'll constantly be talking about this being a low-budget, rapidly produced film. I think it's a mistake to think that that's the equivalent of an artistically inexpert film being made, because if you watch the opening 8 minutes of this film, which is really just a fairly simple scene set in that wonderful noir space of the 1940s, the roadside diner, you just start to appreciate what Ulmer, as an artist and a technician, was able to bring to the film. And I'd point out particularly the use of lighting in this scene, and pay close attention to how Ulmer lights tom-neal's face in the scene, because that's part of what gets us into that dreamlike space that we'll inhabit for most of this film's running time.
Yeah, when that light changes on his face, I mean, not only are we getting the sound mix kind of changing as he goes into this other space to start talking about this flashback and his past and everything, but the way that that light changes on his face and the way that the camera is kind of guiding us, and we'll get this later on in the film too, the way that the camera is kind of almost this more subjective camera. There's one point where it's kind of his point of view, but kind of not, and at this point we're looking right at him, and yeah, that light change from it just being kind of a nice, flatly lit diner kind of scene into this kind of chiaroscuro mess going across his face as he's just, intensely looking into the past, looking into himself, and we've got that song playing that just kind of takes him away into what used to be a better life for him.
Did you ever want to forget anything? Did you ever want to cut away a piece of your memory or blot it out? You can't, no matter how hard you try. You can change the scenery, but sooner or later you'll get a whiff of perfume, or somebody will say a certain phrase or maybe hum something. Then you're licked again. I can't believe that you're in love with me. I used to love that song once. So did the customers back in the old Break of Dawn Club in New York. I can't remember a night when I didn't get at least 3 requests for it. Sue, she was always selling it too. Those were the days.
And then even after that, once we get him and Sue in New York and they're having their gay old time and everything, when they leave that Break of Dawn Club and they're walking along in those New York streets, I mean, I know, again, this is kind of done for, a little bit of, we don't really have the sets, so we're going to kind of blot them out with some fog, but my God, the fog, the smoke that they walk through on these city streets is just amazing, in the way that we kind of, again, through this whole idea of just economy, just getting them from one place to another using the street signs, and that kind of like the background where we can see people but kind of not quite. For sure there's a cop standing there at one point, and he's just kind of blotted out by this gray fog, and it is just amazing to look at.
And that fog, too, for me, is not only, as you were saying, a way to do it on the cheap, because maybe they only had like 50 feet of wall to decorate, and they couldn't, they had to do it in cuts, is also sort of plays up the idea, I think, of the fog between them. There's this, things are getting obfuscated. Things are sort of being put upon them. Things aren't as clear as they used to be in terms of their relationship. And I think that the use of that, like I said, not only works to the economy of the picture, but also works to the feeling, as you were saying, in terms of this expressionistic use of lighting and other things in the film.
Right, and it goes even one step deeper than that, Rob, which is I love the fact that this is all being told as a flashback in tom-neal's memory, and I always read that fog as him attempting to compile this memory, because we're not watching these things even in cinematic time in anything remotely realistic. This is his memory of being back at the break of dawn, because the film opens literally at the ending of the film. And that's where I think you really start to see the craftsmanship of someone like Ulmer. He was really obsessed with telling a great story. And if anyone hasn't seen Detour, what I think people take away and why it really becomes like this film that's a fever memory, the way that it was for Mike when he was introducing the film, it's because Ulmer knows the material he's working with. And this really is ultimately Al's story and what is driving all of the narrative is being told to us all in flashback. And so the fog, to me, is very appropriate as a kind of fuzzy memory that he's reconstructing for us, because the narration is really all pointed towards us in the audience. We're the privileged listeners, but we ultimately have to decide whether or not, what it is that Al's actually telling us in the story.
And we've got this revelation that just kind of comes out of nowhere for us, the audience, and also for Al Roberts, the tom-neal character, where Sue Harvey, who's played by Claudia Drake, announces to him,
"That's the third time you started to tell me something and then stopped. We shouldn't have any secrets from each other, Sue. Next week we're going to make with the ring and the license. You and me will be a team."
Yes, that's right. In the Bush League.
I don't get you.
We've been struck out.
It's a funny way to talk, darling. Don't you want to marry me?
Al, look, I love you. You know I do, and I want to marry you. But not now. Only after we've made good. Sunday I'm going away. Oh, I know you'll think it's silly. That's why I hesitated to tell you. But I'm going to California. I want to try my luck in Hollywood.
That's the most stupid thing I ever heard of. Don't you know millions of people go out there every year and wind up polishing cuspidors? I thought you had better sense.
You sound as if you don't think I have any talent.
That has nothing to do with it.
I'll make out all right.
Maybe. But what about me? Doesn't it mean anything to you that you're busting up all our plans? We may not see each other for years?
It won't be that long.
I thought you loved me.
I do. You know I do.
And this is just a ton of bricks that hits this guy. And I really am not surprised at how he takes it, because this is suddenly coming up that she is just going to be jetting across the country, in a manner of speaking, going across the country and trying her dreams in the Hollywood Dream Factory. Sorry, Al, it's been really nice knowing you, and let's kind of stay friends and everything, or boyfriend and girlfriend, but I'm going to be clear across the other side of the world here for you, so sorry about that. So we get him, I don't know how much time really kind of elapses between him pining away for Sue and him deciding to go out and see her. There is some interesting talk about him kind of being at the club, and he's doing this kind of interesting variation on Brahms where it kind of becomes this boogie-woogie number and then kind of goes back to it, and he ends up getting a $10 tip. And I don't know if that's kind of what puts him on this path, because he uses that, or at least, that is kind of the impetus for him to give Sue a call in a very bizarre phone call where he just talks and we get like one cutaway to her, and she never says a word, which is just a great kind of conversation. And again, I think it definitely plays into that sweet spot you're talking about, Rich, as far as his memory of this. And maybe he doesn't remember what she said, so she doesn't say a damn word. And I think it's just a little bit of a shot that they're going to use later on in the film, and they just kind of transposed it over here.
Well, I mean, I think that goes a little bit towards Goldsmith's screenplay, because in the screenplay, Goldsmith, in the novel that's adapted by Ulmer for this film, Sue is supposed to have a lot of different subplots. And I always feel that first phone call that really seems oddly truncated speaks to Ulmer's desire to just really dispense with the Sue subplot altogether, because at the end of the day, what makes Detour such a fantastic film is going to be the relationship between Al and Vera. And Sue, in many cases, is really an afterthought, especially by the end of the film. It's less so, of course, in the novel. And I think the other part that you bring up is I don't know a film that I love more for not lingering on any of the motives for why things happen from one moment to the next, because you're right. In literally this 3-minute throwaway scene, we have the entire reason for why he's going cross country, and it's ludicrously underdeveloped. I mean, if we're talking about this from like a screenwriting standpoint, I mean, there's like no genuine motivation. He's given a $10 bill, and he looks at it and goes, oh, now I've got an idea that maybe I should go join my fiance in Los Angeles. But I think that's part of the charm of this film is this isn't a film that's ever going to linger on inessential information. And like most of the best noir, there is something that is propelling the story forward that is more than just classical storytelling.
I was shocked when I read the novel of this to know that Sue and Al, I mean, the story goes back and forth between the two of them. We are kind of one chapter of Al, one chapter Sue, back and forth between them as we go through this entire thing, because she is just such an afterthought in the film, and she is dispensed of so quickly. I mean, that dialogue that we get from them as they're walking through the fog, that's pretty much it for Sue. I mean, she doesn't get very much more than that in the movie. And yeah, the book was just filled with stuff. The screenplay that Goldsmith adapted his own screenplay, and then Ulmer just kind of readapted that, said, I'm going to take the best bits of this. And Sue is just, man, she's not there at all. But you're right, it does become the Al and Vera story, though Vera doesn't even show up in the movie until half an hour in, which in a 70-minute movie, you know, it's almost halfway through the film before she even shows up. What we have rather than Vera for a longer time is this character, Charles Haskell Jr., who's played by Ed McDonald, and he is one of the guys that picks up Al. He's pretty much the only one we really see any sort of interaction with as Al is thumbing his ride across America here. Not having too much luck. In one point in the book, they're talking about how he got thrown in the jug, but in the movie, they don't necessarily talk about that. But Al's definitely looking pretty worse for wear by the time that we see Haskell picking him up. And then the relationship between him and Haskell, I mean, for me, talking about screenwriting, this is some of the dialogue for me that just cooks. I love this whole interchange between these two guys as they're going, you know, across country.
Well, the only thing I wanted to add was go back just a bit to the whole Sue plot. And I think that if she was in there more, it would actually, I think, distract and take away from the final film, because we get the feeling that he's motivated by some sort of obsession, or he just wants to be with her, and it's very simple. And what she's doing is kind of beside the point, because as you were saying, it's all out of his memory. It's all out of his own motivation. So the fact that she is sort of elusive and not really fully explained allows us as the audience to kind of fill in those gaps, because we see them in the club and there's a couple of moments and then it's, I'm going, and then it's like, well, I'm going to follow you. So I thought that actually kind of works. I think if she was in there more, it would actually maybe take away from that and make it less strong.
Yeah, we would have had to have had not only more of Sue, but then also given Sue a voiceover, because otherwise there's no way, if this is Al's story, Al's flashback, Al's memory, that she's even going to be able to have a voice, because he just doesn't see her while she's there. And it all has to be kind of interpreted through what Al is experiencing. So to have more Sue just wouldn't fit with the way that this film is structured ultimately, just that this is the Al story. It's interesting to me that when we see this montage before Haskell picks him up, there's a part where he's thumbing his way across country and he seems to be on the wrong side of the road for me. Were you guys kind of picking up on this, that he should be on one side, but he seems to be on the other? And there's even a part where we see this, I guess it's like a farmer or somebody driving him, and the farmer's sitting on the right-hand side rather than on the left-hand side. Is that just like, did they have cars back then that were more British than American?
To me, it looks like someone flipped the negative, but I don't know if that's true or not, because it's like, why is he getting it on that side of the car?
Yeah, I mean, the story that's generally told about that is when Ulmer started filming, he actually was filming all of the car scenes left to right, but then someone in the production mentioned that the action in the film is actually moving right to left because it's moving from New York to L.A., and so he flipped the negative so that it would look like the car was actually traveling west as opposed to traveling east. At this point, it's hard to say, but there is no doubt that a lot of people, and it's some of my favorite, I think, very erroneous data about this film. You know, some people even thought scenes were shot in Britain, which would be absurd because they wouldn't have had the budget for that. Trust me, if he had the budget to get to England, he wouldn't have been spending his time just shooting rear projection car scenes. But yeah, I think that's one of the elements that people point to say this is what happened with Poverty Row films, that they were shot so quickly that mistakes like that could not be undone. The other way, of course, to look at it, the way that I prefer, is that as in any story that has limitations and constraints, Ulmer always, in the final instance, made the strongest choice for the story. And I think there's something amazingly gripping about flipping the negative versus reshooting it. There's something left in the film that we can still pick up on today. So I would put it more in the category of a happy accident, that if people do pick up on it, it just, again, gives one more element of weirdness to this otherwise sublimely wonderful film.
Haskell and Al traveling across country. I love the line that Al has about,
you know, Emily Post ought to write a book of rules for guys thumbing rides. Because as it is now, you never know what's right and what's wrong. We rode along for a little while, neither one of us saying anything. I was glad of that. I never know what to say to strange people driving cars. Then, too, you can never tell if a guy wants to talk. A lot of rides have been cut short because of a big mouth. So I kept my mouth shut until he started opening up.
Finally, they kind of strike up this conversation, and they're going to start ride sharing, and they have this meal together, which is the first meal really that Al has had in a long time. I mean, he's looking pretty, he's got like quite a few days growth of beard. He's looking very ragged and everything. And Haskell is very much, put together. He's definitely carrying a wad of money with him, picking up Al's meal for him and everything. So Al's at one point, at least in the book, he's thinking about, what would it be like if I conked this guy in the head and took his role. But luckily, he doesn't have to do that. They're driving along after this great meal. It starts raining. Next thing you know, Al's like, we should put up the top because it's starting to rain in the car. Haskell's just not moving at all. And he pulls over on the side of the road to put the top up on the car, opens up that door to I don't know what, and Haskell falls out, conks himself right on the head with a rock that's just very conveniently placed. And this was one of those moments when I saw this the first time. I was like, so was he dead beforehand? Is he dead now? What the hell just happened? I had no idea. And then that Al just immediately just jumps into this whole like crazy mindset where it's like,
I saw it once he was dead, and I was in for it. Who would believe he fell out of the car? Why, if Haskell came too, which of course he couldn't, even he would swear I conked him over the head for his dough. Yes, I was in for it. Instinct told me to run, but then I realized it was hopeless. There were lots of people back down the road who could identify me. That gas station guy and the waitress. I would be in a worse spot then, trying to explain why I beat it. next possibility was to sit tight and tell the truth when the cops came. But that would be crazy. He'd laugh at the truth. And I'd have my head in the noose. So what else was there to do but hide the body and get away in the car? I couldn't leave the car there with him in the gully. That would be like erecting a tombstone.
And he just immediately takes the worst case scenario and just spins it into this mad narrative, this self-narrative of, oh my God, I am done for because this guy happened to die while I was driving with him. And it just ends up he thinks everyone's going to think that he was a murderer. So I got to dispose of this body right now. He just does the worst thing that he can possibly do.
Yeah, and I think to just build on that point, that's always one of those moments that I always wonder why Al makes some of the choices he makes, because if Haskell's really just dying a natural death, I mean, he really should just flag down an officer of the law and just say, the guy I was hitching with has died of natural circumstances. And some of his logic that story would be unbelievable would be completely backed up by any autopsy. He didn't do anything to actually murder Haskell. And it points to a couple different things that just, again, I find enjoyable about this particular story. I really sometimes wonder just how much I can trust Al's narration, because this is all happening in flashback and it's all happening as a story being told by Al. And we get into a classic situation, just how much do we believe Al's story? I mean, in fact, this might be some type of psychoanalytic rationalization that, in fact, he did do something to Haskell, and this is just his way, kind of in almost a Hitchcockian frame of repression, saying, this is how I'm going to tell this story because I really am not that guy. And or the other way to look at it again is that this isn't really a film that I've ever spent a lot of time thinking about in terms of plot, because what energizes me every time I watch this film is the moment he makes that decision. The final, say, 44 or so minutes of the film are just stunningly stupendous and internally consistent, that something kind of bizarre shifts at that moment. Like the first half of the film, there's a whole series of what ifs, and those what ifs all start to dissipate into actually, the Al and Vera story that really is less about choices that Al really has any sort of power to make because of the domination of the absolutely once in a lifetime performance of Ann Savage as Vera.
So let's get to that performance. It doesn't take very long before Al makes this really stupid decision. I'm going to take the place of Haskell. He takes his clothes, takes his money, takes everything, gets in the car, takes care of Haskell's body, and off he goes and picks up Vera pretty soon thereafter. And then it's kind of interesting to me because, like you were saying, as far as this whole idea of this kind of memory repression and how are we interpreting this story through Al, it's interesting to me that Vera gets in the car, everything's kind of hunky-dory, she falls asleep, and then kind of like Haskell didn't do, she wakes up, and she is almost the voice from beyond the grave at this point, because as soon as she wakes up, she is just like, where's the guy who owned this car? What's going on? And she just becomes that voice, that inner dialogue that Al had of this is what people are going to think. Suddenly she becomes that voice, and it is just like, what did you do with this guy? Where's his body? What happened? And just lays into him, and he tries to explain it, which they do off screen, him explaining the whole story, and she just doesn't seem to buy it. She still thinks that he's a murderer, and who really cares? You are now under my power. And she just becomes this kind of force of nature, this kind of harpy that has just like got her claws into his shoulders, and she is just going to ride him for the rest of this film. And I absolutely love it. And just the way, I mean, this Ann Savage, you couldn't get a better name for this actress. Ann Savage's performance as Vera, just the way she spits that dialogue into his face all the time. She is like the ultimate femme fatale for me.
And I just have to piggyback on that point, Mike, because I just love the way you phrase that. And you kind of help crystallize something in my mind that I think I frequently overlook when I'm watching this film. We always talk about Detour as this really amazing film noir. But of course, at the point that Edgar Ulmer is making this film, the term film noir is really not in popular circulation. The term's really not coined in any meaningful sense until 1946, a year after the production of this film. And the way you talked about Vera there reminds me that the director of The Black Cat, the classic Karloff Lugosi film that Rob mentioned earlier in this podcast, that it's a moment where the tone of the film shifts into horror. I mean, this is a moment straight out of universal 1930s horror films. And Vera is this kind of avenging angel figure, and she is galvanizing. And part of her power is that kind of horror power that we associate with characters like Dracula, that they are such an embodiment of power, they end up consuming this other character in the film like Vera consumes Al.
You know, she's sort of like every man's worst nightmare. She's very erratic, and it's almost like this. If we would have had more of the relationship in the first part of the film with him and Sue, which we do have a little bit, but not a lot, you can sort of interpret that maybe this might be the sort of the Funhouse Mirror version, that if that one was good and everything was lovely, as he says in the voiceover, that this one is sort of the marriage that's gone wrong, and how he relates to Vera. And there's moments with her where she's trying to be tender with him, and it's like, hey, you know, you should come over here, or you should come with me. And he's like, you know, like, get away from me, I'm not in the mood for that right now. And there's just these fights and this like power play between them. So like I said, I sort of saw them as mirrored versions of relationships that he's had, that is two different relationships, although this one's much more, I guess you could say, conniving and brutal.
Yeah, you get the feeling like there are those weird moments where she is trying to be tender, but she's been just such this crazed. I'm sorry, I keep going back to the word harpy, but she's just been that way to him for so much, and just, you know, constantly throwing it out to him like, I could call the cops at any minute, da 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 da, and then she kind of just turns on the syrup, and it's like you almost expect him, maybe he would fall for it once and she would just laugh him, you know, right out of the bedroom or whatever. But it just, yeah, she just vacillates so much, just so wildly in her tone toward him and everything. It's just like, oh my God, what is going on here? And it just kind of even, you know, kicks that up a notch as far as this whole idea of what is Al telling us and what do we necessarily believe? You know, would she go from being this complete bitch to this, you know, trying to get love from him at one point and then, you know, nothing? But so we get all the way into Los Angeles. We have several things going on. This whole idea that they're going to sell his car, Haskell's car, and then Al will be free of her forever, free of Vera, and then he'll be able to find Sue and just kind of go on with everything. Unfortunately, things change when Vera finds a newspaper article that Charles Haskell Sr. is at death's door and they're looking for the son. So she gets this crazy idea, again, this like almost as crazy, if not crazier, of all the things that were running through Al's head when Haskell died. She gets this idea like, oh, Al, you'll just pretend to be Haskell and you'll go and you'll collect all this money from this dying man or dead man. You need to continue on with this charade. And he, you know, again, it's like every reason in the book why this wouldn't work, but she still insists that it's going to, and it just becomes this whole roundabout kind of dialogue again where they're just going on and on. But rather than Al having all this stuff in his head, now he has this other person, and I'm putting person in quotation marks because it's almost like she's a figment of his imagination, where it's just going on and on and on. Like, you should do this. No, I shouldn't. Here's the reason why I shouldn't, but you should because we can get this money and da 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 da. And it's like just craziness. And this kind of goes on a little bit too long for me, which is kind of weird to say that in a movie that's only 70 minutes long. This part kind of drags for me when they're kind of stuck together in this apartment together. And but I think it also kind of works just because it is like Al is there by himself and just torturing himself, but he has this other figure of Vera to kind of torture him for himself, you know.
This was early in the evening, and the conversation, while hectic, was at least pitched low. But as the minutes passed, and more obstacles to her plan popped into my head, the air got blue,
each word coming from our lips cracked like a whip. I reminded her that as Charles Haskell, I didn't even know my mother's name, where I'd gone to school, the name of my best friend, whether I had an Aunt Emma or not, my religion, and if I'd ever owned a dog. I didn't even know what my middle initial stood for. I also pointed out that the real Haskell had a scar on his forearm.
His people never saw that scar. He told me you ran away right after putting out the kid's eye.
Yeah, but his father knew he was cut. It had to be some kind of a mark.
So what? The old man's dead, or will be. I hope by tomorrow morning's papers.
It doesn't go too slow for me. I really appreciate the fact that at that point in the story of Detour, Ulmer boils it down to the absolute essentials. It really becomes a two-person play at that point. The abusive Vera and the changing, shifting emotional landscape of Al. And you really, for me, Ulmer has a real difficult transition he needs to enact, because whatever sympathies we might feel for Al in relationship to what happened with Haskell, in order to get Vera out of his life, he can no longer be passive. Pretty much whatever happened via Haskell was a passive response to a fateful incident that he handled in a way that led towards it being a criminal endeavor. But in order to really rid Vera, he is going to have to ultimately employ the ultimate last resort, which is to, kill her. And Ulmer needs to do that in literally 2 scenes or less. And a lot of films would spend, 90 minutes building up a powder keg. Think about like Jack Nicholson in The Shining. Like, to get someone to that powder keg state usually is something directors do really, really slowly over multiple scenes in a movie. Ulmer does it in 2 scenes. And by the time he gets to his breaking point, I always find it highly believable. I mean, at that point, I kind of want to snap Vera's neck myself.
I love the line in the movie when he talks about,
If this were fiction, I would fall in love with Vera, marry her, and make a respectable woman of her. Or else she'd make some supreme Class A sacrifice for me and die. Sue and I would bawl a little over her grave and make some crack about there's good in all of us. But Vera, unfortunately, was just as rotten in the morning as she'd been the night before.
She had some good in her, and I was going to bring it out. But no, she has no good in her at all.
That's what makes her the ultimate femme fatale. I mean, I always thought Kathy Moffat in Out of the Past is one of my favorite femme fatales, who literally is one of the, baddest characters in the entire female canon of noir. And yet there really is only one queen in my book, and it's Anne Savage playing Vera.
I love how the phone plays into this part of the movie. I mean, the phone has kind of been with us through a lot of the film. We introduced it in New York with Al calling up Sue, and we get a little bit of Sue again with this phone call, but yet he's not ready to talk to her. He can't even say hello to her on the phone. And then we get Vera using the phone, trying to call the police, threatening Al with it. And then the phone is ultimately the murder weapon. And this was that other moment when I saw this film originally where I was like, am I really supposed to be believing this? That in this drunken state, Vera takes the phone. She's finally says that she's going to call the cops on Al, takes it, locks the door on him, and it somehow, as she's making her way to the bed, wraps the cord around her neck, and then Al is grabbing onto that cord on the other side of the door and chokes the life out of Vera. One of the strangest and most satisfying cinematic deaths that I've ever seen. And just, oh my God, like I said, I was just flabbergasted. I really could not believe that I had just seen what I had saw.
And Ulmer knows that. The part that is so memorable about that scene, if some of the people listening to this podcast haven't seen the film before, you definitely want to watch that final ending after her strangulation by telephone cord, because the shot staging and shot choices made by Ulmer are the evidence of a first-rate directorial talent with ambition to burn. She is modeled perfectly in a mirror shot that is just exquisitely designed. When you watch Al walking around the apartment, Vera is almost always in her death state, visible in the background in this real interesting position because she's lying dead on the bed with just this one arm dangling in just a very evocative way. And then he even goes even deeper into the cinematic playbook with this series of pull-in, pull-out focus shots as Al matches his voiceover narration and the room goes in and out of focus around various objects, ending with one of my favorite shots in the film, actually showing the phone box at the baseboard level of the apartment. I mean, it's like it has gotten fetishized to such a degree in Al's mind. It actually like literally goes all the way into Bell Labs itself. I mean, this is like a murder by telephony of just the most grandiose proportions.
The world is full of skeptics. I know. I'm one myself. In the Haskell business, how many of you would believe he fell out of the car? And now, after killing Vera without really meaning to do it, how many of you would believe it wasn't premeditated? In a jury room, every last man of you would go down shouting that she had me over a barrel and my only out was force. The room was still. So quiet that for a while I wondered if I had suddenly gone deaf. It was pure fear, of course. And I was hysterical. But without making a sound. Vera was dead. And I was her murderer. Murderer. What an awful word that is. But I'd become one. I'd better not get caught. What evidence there was around the place had to be destroyed. And from the looks of things, there was plenty. Looking around the room at things we'd bought was like looking into the faces of 100 people who'd seen us together and who remembered me. This was the kind of testimony I couldn't rub out. No. I could burn clothes and hide bottles for the next 5 years. There'd always be witnesses. The landlady, for one. She could identify me. The car dealer, the waitress in the drive-in, the girl in the dress shop, and that guy in the liquor store. They could all identify me. I was cooked. Done for. I had to get out of there. While once I'd remained beside a dead body, planning carefully how to avoid being accused of killing him, this time I couldn't. This time I was guilty. I knew it. Felt it. I was like a guy suffering from shock. Things were whirling around in my head. I couldn't make myself think right. All I could think of was the guy with the saxophone and what he was playing. It wasn't a love song anymore. It was a dirge.
That series of shots that you're talking about is the stuff where, yeah, that's kind of POV shot from Al as he's focusing in on different things in the room. That is just absolutely wonderful. And that was one of those where it's just like, this is a master craftsman. I don't care about how cheap certain things look. I don't care about anything else. This is the stuff where it's like, you have got to be kidding me. This is amazing just to hear this voiceover and to see the way he's taking us around this room and kind of re-examining everything through this new light of Vera's death. It was just terrific. Al travels all the way across the country, and he still never gets to see Sue, which I find to be one of the great ironies of this film.
Well, it should be, because it's in the original script that he actually kind of has a moment in the Martin-Goldsmith screenplay where there is closure to the fiancé story, but I don't see where Ulmer could even have put it in any meaningful way, because part of that structuring absence of Sue just has to remain a structuring absence even at the end. I mean, once he strangles Vera, the story has a really interesting coda that brings us back to a land of diners and the present day. But the film veers really powerfully for me in those final 5 minutes into some of the best noir philosophizing on celluloid that you can possibly find.
That ending, the end scene, the end monologue, voiceover, all of that is classic film noir. And I've heard that they reshot the end or added the cops at the end because of the Hays Code at the time. No criminal could get away with murder, and Al clearly does say that he has murdered Vera. And again, we go into this whole irony kind of thing where it's not Al who murdered Vera. It is Haskell who is blamed for the murder of Vera. So Al really is kind of getting off scot-free in a way, other than that he now lives with this feeling that he has murdered Vera, which, he did. But, oh my goodness, him walking along that lonely road at night and the cops coming up, and it's great because the way that the book ended, and I imagine that the screenplay ended the same way, he does have this line about God or fate or some mysterious force can put the finger on you or on me for no good reason at all. The addition of these cops who just pull up, open up the door, and put them in, you really couldn't get better than that.
In that ending where the cops just pull up and put him in the car with really no protest, almost reminded me of like scenes of mentally ill people being picked up and taken away, where it's just like, all right, buddy, like, come on, they just kind of put their arm around him and put him in the car and drive him off. And I sort of saw that he was like really broken in the end. Like he wasn't even like gonna fight. It's like, why even bother? Resigned.
Yeah, and that's just such a great point, Rob, because when that car pulls up, I mean, it's absolutely absurd. I mean, how would they even know that this is the guy? I am a big fan of the censorship tacked on endings in noir, because this isn't the Hollywood musical. This isn't the conventional romance. Noir always was going to have a problem because the Hays Code forbid anyone getting away with crimes, and yet at the core of the noir moral code, you had to have characters that fundamentally got away with crime. And so these tacked on endings are just absolutely delirious in their nonconformity to the rest of what you have just watched. I mean, I'm positive that audiences in 1945 didn't even buy it. And what I love about what Ulmer did is it is so understated. I mean, he doesn't have like handcuffs slapped on him or have a scene in his, a jail door slamming. It's just this weird moment. And I think Rob put his finger on it, where you really just have Al literally as a utterly traumatized shell of a human being, literally just needed to be whisked off somewhere, and probably Bellevue's as good a place as any for what he went through for having to spend a couple days of his life with Vera.
It just really had this feeling of being collected. It didn't have the feeling of being arrested or, fighting the law. It was like being collected. It was just like, oh, hey, there's a guy on the side of the road. Let's pick him up. All right, let's take him off. You get this total, like I said, this total feeling of resignation. It's like, it's over. I didn't go see my girl. She doesn't want me. I killed this guy, or maybe I didn't. Then I killed this other woman. There's nothing. Like, what the hell am I even doing with my life?
Al is done. Even if these cops are just picking him up to be nice or something, hey, buddy, get in the car. It's going to start raining soon or whatever. You know that he's just like, I killed a guy. I killed this woman as soon as he gets in there.
No, you can definitely tell that he's wanting to tell his story. And that's what's so exciting about that final coda in the diner, is you really get a sense this whole time that part of what the entire voiceover narration is he wants the audience to be part of his absolution from just this really bad period in his life. And I really feel he was, at the end of this film, someone who really, for purely personal reasons, wanted to confess. This was a guy that even if the cops weren't going to pick him up, in an alternate film a week from now, he was just going to walk into a police station and turn himself in. He couldn't live with himself anymore. The fickle finger of fate in this film absolutely did a number on this guy, and that's why it is such a brilliant noir, and why it's so hard to remake these films nowadays, because we just don't seem to make these films as Ulmer did, with such a true belief in just how the world can truly wring every last part of someone's soul from them and just leave them as a shell of a person. And that's the genius you have in a film like Detour.
All right, we're going to take a break and play an interview with Noah-Isenberg. He's the author of Edgar-g-Ulmer, a filmmaker at the margins, after these important messages.
Hey, this is Chris from the Weedsman Podcast, Unregimented, and I'm the founder of Christopher Media, and I have a call to action for all of you Christopher Media listeners. Rob St. Mary, you may know him from the Projection Booth Podcast. Well, he's written himself a book called Re-Entry, the Orbit Anthology. This book chronicles 35 years of Detroit's rise to cultural prominence through the pages of Orbit, White Noise, and Fun magazines. You can help by going to patronicity.com or orbitbookdetroit.com and donating whatever you can to help make this book possible. Your tax-deductible support will help create a lasting document to over 35 years of vital Detroit cultural history as told through Orbit, Fun, and White Noise magazines. This deluxe illustrated edition will not only feature reprints of popular articles, but also tell the behind-the-scenes stories of how these landmark magazines covered Detroit's music, film, art, food, and creative scene like no one else dared, and with a healthy dose of humor. Please give whatever you can to make this landmark publication possible, and make sure to check out the Projection Booth Podcast and all of the other great shows at ChristopherMedia.net. I thank you for listening, and I thank all of you for the support.
We are the Popcorn Poops. My name is Dustin.
And my name is Jessica.
And together we produce Popcorn Poops, the best married couple movie commentary track podcast on the internet.
Join us each week as we take turns picking films and then watch and discuss them together. If you're at home or with a computer or device, you can sync up the movie and watch it right along with us.
However, you don't have to sync up the film to enjoy the show. Feel free to tune in like you would to any other podcast.
Please visit us on the internet at www.popcornpoops.com.
Again, that's www.popcornpoops.com.
Let me ask you a question. Are you getting enough? I bet you'd love more, right? Well, adamandeve.com wants to give you more with 10 free gifts. First, you'll get a sexy surprise for her. Second, a specially selected toy for him. And third, a little something we know you'll both enjoy. Plus, you'll get 6 full-length adult movies on DVD. And number 10, free shipping on your entire order. So what do you have to do to get your 10 free gifts? It's not hard. Just go to adamandeve.com and select any one item. It could be an adventurous new toy, sexy piece of lingerie, or anything you desire. Just enter offer code BOOTH at checkout, and you'll get all 10 free gifts. Go check out adamandeve.com today. Select one item and get 10 free gifts, including free shipping when you enter offer code BOOTH. That's BOOTH at adamandeve.com.
I wear a few hats at the New School, but within the New School, which is a quirky place to begin with and made up of many, many divisions, I run the little film program. It's only been in existence for about 5 years. It's called Screen Studies. There were a number of colleagues of mine who felt that was a more forward-looking designation for the study of film and other digital media. So it's Screen Studies, and I direct that program at Eugene Lang College, which is the New School for Liberal Arts. It's a liberal arts college within the New School in New York City. And I'm also then chair of the Department of Culture and Media. And beyond that, too, I'm also a professor of in this committee on liberal studies, an interdisciplinary program. It's an MA degree within the New School for Social Research, which was where most of the graduate programs are housed. And one of those programs is called the Committee on Liberal Studies. Not exactly like the University of Chicago's Committee on Social Thought, but something like that in the sense that it's a very interdisciplinary program. So I then teach courses there as well. I've been at the New School for now about a decade. Prior to that, I taught for close to a decade at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, where I was toward the end split between German studies and film studies. And Wesleyan has a terrific film studies program that's been rather distinguished for several decades now, in large measure due to its very charismatic leader, Janine Basinger, whose I don't know, whose work you may or may not know. So that's my story, and then I write a fair amount of freelance work as a book critic for different places, and I am the book review editor for Film Quarterly magazine, a magazine that's published by the University of California Press, and is currently edited now by B. Ruby Rich.
So you kind of brought your love of the German with the film. You wrote about the Weimar films before, correct?
That was the transition, really. I taught a lot of Weimar cinema. Here's where Ulmer came in, really, which was that I would teach Weimar cinema. I taught it at Wesleyan. I was a TA for my then dissertation advisor at Berkeley in the Weimar cinema course that he does at Berkeley. This is Anton Kays or Tony Kays. And then at Wesleyan, I taught it, it was sort of one of my bread and butter courses. And when I say this is where Ulmer came in, because I would end that course always with The Black Cat, which was my little sort of coda, what happens to Weimar after Weimar? What happens to Weimar when Weimar crosses the Atlantic? And so Ulmer's, his entry to the universal horror cycle, The Black Cat, was always kind of an homage to Weimar cinema. And it's one of those films that, at least on a kind of personal basis for Ulmer, I think, links him up, too, to these films to which he'd always asserted this kind of deeper attachment. But those links are, in many instances, a bit, tenuous at best, if not outright, dubious. When he claims, for instance, I know you may be familiar with this, is the three-part interview with Peter Bogdanovich, conducted just a couple of years before Ulmer passed away so the interviews were conducted in 1970, passed away in the final day of September 1972. In that interview with Peter Bogdanovich, he tells me, Junior, who this is Carl Laemmle's son, Junior Laemmle, gave me, I think it was, a free hand to direct as we had done with Caligari, to direct in the style as we had done with Caligari. So, this assertion of being a part of Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Caligari was in production. Ulmer would have been 15 years old. So, he certainly identified with these Weimar films, these legendary films, whether there's the Golem or Caligari or Lang's two-part Nibelungen series and through Metropolis and so forth. Black Cat was a way, I think, for him to kind of claim that cherished cultural legacy of Weimar cinema, even if he himself didn't really have all that much to do with Weimar cinema. I think it was just that for him it was part of his intellectual and his filmic heritage.
How did you go from kind of using Black Cat as this bookend for a class into actually writing a monogram on Detour?
Of the films that people who know anything, there's that perennial question, Edgar G. Who? Vincent Canby, when he wrote a piece, when Film Forum did a retrospective in 92, and he began with that, and there was a piece in the Atlanta Constitution, I think it was, that bore that very title, Edgar G. Who? Well, if they know anything about Edgar G. Who, or Edgar G. Ulmer, it's usually they know of The Black Cat, and then maybe they know about Detour, because Detour is, I think you can claim, is best-known film. And so when I started to make the move from just teaching German or Austrian cinema to teaching more American cinema and, classical Hollywood, and then later kind of independent cinema, sci-fi stuff, and horror and whatnot, a whole variety of genres, I began one of the courses, again, almost like the Weimar cinema course that I taught with considerable frequency, was a course on film noir. And Detour is, if not Ulmer's best-known film, and I think it probably is, it's the one with which he certainly identified most. While I was writing what began as a scholarly study of Ulmer's work and sort of morphed into a critical biography, but while I was writing it, really the link, the point at which it kind of turns into that biography, I think was when I was able to, when I was commissioned to write the Detour monograph for the BFI's Film Classics series. And that's when, in writing for, they have a pretty strict format for those books. One of the things that they really, I think, want authors to emphasize is this sort of mix of kind of more mainstream film criticism and even somewhat more biographical writing with something that's a bit more academic and scholarly. And so this gave me a chance, I think, to test out my ideas on Ulmer, zeroing in on what is arguably his best-known film, and to see whether or not I could maybe write for a wider audience and to try to take the example, that wonderful example of the BFI Film Classics series, and use that as a means to sort of shift gears and change the tenor of the project overall. And that's in fact, that's really what occurred. So that the Detour book appeared in 2008, and during that academic year, then I was fortunate enough to get a grant to spend a year in Berlin working in the Paul Kohner archives. And Paul Kohner was known as the magician of Sunset Boulevard, was one of these agents who represented lots and lots of European transplants, Ulmer among them. And so I spent a year working at the Berlin Film Museum. That's where the papers, the Paul Kohner papers, are housed. And that's when the book really turned much, much more into a biography. So even in the little Detour monograph for the BFI Film Classics series, I think you'll see certain facets of Ulmer's biography represented there in that book. But with the year spent sifting through all the papers, all the memoranda, and all these letters, especially these letters between Ulmer and his main agent at the Kohner office, who was a Viennese-born woman named Ilse Lahn, that really allowed me to change the book from just being a kind of a study of his cinematic output, more of an academic or scholarly study of the cinematic output, to a critical biography. When I look back now, as I'm able to do, because I'm finally on the other side. I dreamed of ultimately reaching that other side for so many years. I worked on this book for well over a decade. But as I'm now able to do, to look back, I really see the Detour monograph as being a kind of a critical turning point, in that it gave me the chance to write on film in a slightly different style and with the explicit intent of reaching a wider audience. Whether or not that was totally successful with that book, I can't really say, but I think it did help to get me to rethink what I was going to do with the Ulmer project. And really, it's from that point onward that I suddenly thought of the book as not just a study of Ulmer's films, but really a study of his life. And I knew it was going to be a difficult life to write because of all the different stories that Ulmer told at different points in his life, and trying to sort of sort out a lot of the tall tales that he told without being in any way sort of smug or self-satisfied. I really am happy that it took that term, because I feel that, as we were talking about moments ago, it's enabled me to have a chance to speak to people I don't think I would have been able to speak to had I just written more of an academic, or scholarly study of Ulmer's work, and had it been much more theoretically inflected, and had it been written in a way that is certainly de rigueur in academic circles, but is often seen as, and with good reason, seen as kind of opaque and impenetrable for those who reside outside the ivory towers. So I didn't want to do that. I think over the years I'd written enough for kind of more popular venues, writing, kind of book criticism and also just doing a little bit of film criticism and more kind of personal essays and that sort of thing over the years, that I just realized that was not where this project belonged. And Ulmer's following, too, really wasn't strictly an academic following. Sure, his films have been taught, and I was among those who taught the films in certain academic courses, but I think that his most ardent following, after the sort of the French around the Carrier du Cinema circle and those loose affiliates or people who are central to the Carrier circle, the next group that really championed his work and I think deserves the lion's share of the credit are the people who wrote for these kind of more underground newspapers, whether it was Myron Meisel at the Boston Phoenix or at the Chicago, The Reader, the Village Voice, if you think of people like Hoberman. And Dave Kerr was at the Chicago Reader as well, right? Dave Kerr and I think it was Myron Meisel who also had been at the Reader. I always get they kind of bounced back and forth, and Meisel published a lot of stuff in the Boston Phoenix. But the Voice, the Boston Phoenix, the Chicago Reader, these are the people who really were the sort of early champions of Ulmer's work. And so to write a scholarly tome in a way would have been kind of blasphemy in a way. I mean, it would have deprived the legitimate circle of Ulmer supporters and people who'd even brought Ulmer to critical attention. It would have, I don't know, it just sort of struck me as anathema in a way. And so I was glad that I don't want to make it into some sort of like incredible epiphany, but I'm just glad that having written that Detour book, that I was able to rethink the project and especially rethink style in which I wanted to write that project. And it's funny, there have been a lot of reviews, most recently in the August issue of Sight and Sound. And Nick Pinkerton, who wrote, it's a lovely review. He calls me out, and there are certain moments in the book where even as hard as I may have tried to reach a wider audience without, completely pandering shamelessly, given my background, given my training, there are certain moments, and Nick Pinkerton in his review in Sight and Sound, the August issue, he kind of calls me out on it and very, very gently, very nicely. But there are still certain moments in the biography, and you may have caught some of them too, where just there's whatever it is, the Teutonic syntax, or that sort of whether it's my penchant for sometimes using foreign words or whatever it is. I mean, I try my best not to. I've tried to unlearn all the bad habits that I learned in graduate school. But even so, I think there's still a few buried in there, just as you have all sorts of wonderful continuity flaws and imperfections buried in Detour. So maybe it's somewhat befitting then of a subject like Ulmer, that I would have my own little imperfections and flaws that are buried in the biography. But among them, just that occasional inability to make that last step in producing kind of pellucid prose.
I really appreciated how much he humanized him, especially through the use of the letters, through the use of his book that he was working on, which was very autobiographical. Well, it's sort of a veil. I mean, in a way, it's a veiled autobiography, Beyond the Boundary, this novel that he wrote. So much of that is autobiographical. But go ahead. Thank you. I am glad that you found that useful. I interrupted you, though. Go ahead. Ulmer really was one to adorn the truth quite a bit. Yeah. And sometimes I wonder if it was the people to whom he was writing, or if he was actually kind of fibbing to himself when it came to a lot of the times where you would document these letters where, everything looks great. I am going to be, heading right into the sunset with this project. This is fantastic. And again, I don't know if that was pulling the leg of whoever he was writing to, or if he really felt like that was what was really going to happen.
I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think you've picked up on something that's really important for his life and his career, namely that when he was writing those kinds of letters that you just, so whether it's from the Hollywood Plaza and he's writing to Shirley and saying, I'm as good as gold, and I'm going to be the big man on the Paramount lot, and I'm going to direct a remake of The Blue Angel starring Veronica Lake, and an adaptation of a George S. Kaufman and Mark Connolly play, Beggar on Horseback. Yes, in one sense, I think he was trying to convince Shirley, because he didn't want her. He was his lifelong collaborator, even if he in numerous instances wasn't the most loyal husband. She was his lifelong collaborator, his biggest fan, his biggest champion, and she carried the torch until his daughter Ariane really picked up that and carried the torch, and continues to carry that torch. But I think it was a means of legitimizing his choices and his career in the eyes of Shirley, and then by extension the eyes of Ariane. And as you, I think, astutely picked up on me, it was also as a means of somehow talking through these difficult moments in his life and his career to himself. So he'd write this, and he couldn't give up on himself. I mean, if he gave up on himself, obviously his career would be all over. And I wanted to think of it in such careerist terms. It wasn't even just that. He would have just gone belly up. I mean, he was barely eking out a living at numerous points in his career, and to completely lose faith, who knows what he would have ended up doing? It's hard for me to imagine. But so in the face of adversity, in the face, working for all these bottom of the barrel studios, and with a lot of bit players from the B movie circuit, and shady producers and all this, he had to somehow, even if in some cases, as you rightly point out, it was heavily embroidered or embellished, adorned his stories. He had to believe in himself, and I think that he did so. Obviously, he overextended that, but I think that it enabled him to retain a sense of artistic integrity when working in a world that had really very little artistic integrity. So in other words, when directing some of the trashiest of trashy B pictures that he made, whether it's Girls in Chains, for example. I have a soft spot for My Son, the Hero, but it's really not a great B movie. Both these movies were among the 11 feature-length films that he directed for PRC between 1942 and 46, and it's not a particularly charitable way of referring to these films as dross or trash, but I think the if we can step back and look at them in relation to other movies that were being made at that time, you could say, in fact, these are really not great movies. And for him to make these movies and to continue at the rate that he did, as I mentioned, PRC churning out 11 feature-length films as director, and working on all sorts of scripts and co-producing and doing all sorts of other things there. In many ways, towards the end of his 4-year stint there, he kind of served as a kind of ersatz head of production. But what kept him going is that faith that he actually would, in fact, whether he's going to make it big and become some sort of that elusive dream of becoming a big man on a lot at one of the majors, or whether it was just that he was going to create some sort of strive for some sort of artistic truth, some sort of ineffable. I'm not sure what, but I think that there is that. That's part of if I think of Ulmer as fabulous and the mendacious aspect of Ulmer's personal life as well as his professional life, I think that a kind of corollary to that, or some analogy to that, is that over-striving, overreaching. He did that overreaching even on some of the his lowliest productions. He would strive to include some sort of artistic flourish. And that's, I think, that for those people who spent enough time with his, with his films, that's one of the things that I think leaves people scratching their head, like, wow, what, this is crazy. So a film like Girls in Chains, to have that crazy sequence, using rear projection that takes place at the Niagara Falls, and the sort of dumping of this body, these sorts of just extraordinary little sequences, and I can very easily get called to task on this, and some people have, I think, if not done so with malice, have at least challenged me on this, for looking at each of these little pictures for just some flash, whether it's sort of, a la Andrew Sarris, some sort of signature style. And I'm not really sure that you can find that in Ulmer's work throughout his, 35-year career trajectory, or whether it's just what I was saying, these mind, or head-scratching moments where you look at some of these lowliest productions with which he was associated and see this kind of, not necessarily a flash of genius, but something that you just wouldn't expect from otherwise sort of a throwaway picture, one of these sort of fly-by-night melodramas that he made, say, for PRC. Club Havana is another example of that. Club Havana, there's this incredible sequence in the parking lot, this murder scene, that's just, it's actually, I don't want to use the term brilliant too loosely. I don't think that it's necessarily brilliant, but it is so stirring and so somehow compelling in a film that otherwise is really just kind of done using blood, sweat, tears, scotch tape, and very little film stock and 2-to-1 shooting ratio, whatever it is that he had on that production. So in other words, this really, really impoverished production, and there you have this amazing sequence in the parking lot, the shootout. So those are those moments when you, again, for anyone who spends a lot of time with his work, and there are those. I'm not much of a sci-fi buff or a sci-fi head, but there are people who would argue the same, and I wouldn't necessarily disagree with them about the two pictures that he shot back to back on that abandoned hangar in Fort Worth, Texas, Beyond the Time Barrier and Amazing Transparent Man, and especially Beyond the Time Barrier, just the incredible visual sophistication of a $10,000 production that was done in 6 days. And again, I don't quote me. It couldn't have been a hell of a lot more than that. It was definitely done in 6 days because he made 2 pictures in 2 weeks. 6 days happened to be that was what Ulmer always or frequently gave for his films, and there were several that took considerably longer than 6 days. In the case of Beyond the Time Barrier and Amazing Transparent Man, I think you can take Ulmer at his word. But in a film like Beyond the Time Barrier, there too, just the incredible visual style in a film that is so cheap, it's really quite amazing.
So we're almost on the eve of the 70th anniversary of Detour. Why are we still talking about this cheapy little film noir from 70 years ago?
One of the great reasons is I'll have to defer to good old Martin Scorsese on this, and the documentary that he did, The Journey Through American Cinema, where he thinks of this film as being really essentially kind of and I'm just paraphrasing, but something akin to a kind of a distillation of noir. This is noir at its reeking, rotten essence. And I think there really is something to that. It is so utterly minimalist, so elemental. There is something so still when you watch it. I mean, again, the film is riddled with continuity flaws and imperfections and so forth, but there is something so visceral, so gripping about just sort of these figures who are clawing their way through the film, and for me, of course, as a biographer, is seeing Ulmer claw his way through this picture as well. It is also to some degree a kind of little engine that could story. I mean, this is a film that was one of the very first, I should say, B picture to gain entry to the National Film Registry of the Library of Congress. And actually, Dave Kerr was one of the people who was pushing for that in 1990, I believe it was. It's an amazing feat that this little bastard child of Hollywood managed to outrun its fate and to gain entry to the pantheon of film noir. And people who study noir, and again, I'm speaking as to some degree as somebody who operates from within the Academy, but also even outside the Academy, those people who are interested in noir and who attend the Eddie Muller's annual gatherings, or who go to NoirCon in Philadelphia, whatever it is that you do, Detour still remains one of the central films for anyone who is interested in that period. And I think that again, it is the rawness, it is this sort of distillation of that nasty spirit of noir. It certainly has something to do. I mean, I am enormously taken with the performance by Anne Savage, and think that she was one of the great underrated actors who also, like tom-neal, her counterpart, was sort of toiling in the lower depths of the B-movie circuit, and she never really got her break. But her performance in Detour is as nasty as it should have been, and is really just, I think, striking, gripping, and I just never see. I've seen that movie so many times. And one of the great pleasures that I take in watching it today is watching it with my students and seeing their response, especially to Anne Savage, when she sort of drops in halfway into the picture, and as I write in the little BFI book, kind of holds things in headlock until her unceremonious departure towards the end of the film. And she is, I think, another great reason in terms of why, in terms of the endurance, in terms of the lasting power of that film. Anne Savage's performance, it was really so far ahead of her time. I mean, she was just such a badass. And I don't know whether you're familiar with Guy Madden's My Winnipeg, which was, he managed to coax Anne Savage out of retirement to play his mother in this docu-fantasia from 2007, just a year before she passed away. If you haven't had a chance to see it, it's certainly worth seeing, because she somehow manages, or maybe it's, again, through Guy Madden's brilliant direction, but manages to kind of rekindle that fiery spirit of Vera in My Winnipeg. And so I think that, Anne Savage is definitely an important factor in understanding why it is that film, she is one of the baddest of badass femme fatales to emanate from the silver screen during the heyday of film noir. Every bit as lethal and as acid-tongued as Barbara Stanwyck in Double Indemnity. Vera is so much rawer than Barbara Stanwyck. And I adore Barbara Stanwyck. I think that she's extraordinary, as Phyllis Dietrichson in Double Indemnity. But Anne Savage's Vera is just, it is really, she makes that claim to Al Roberts when they're sort of locked in that Buick, that she'll have him locked up in an Arizona prison so fast that'll give him the bends, I think, as she puts it in that line of dialogue. And I find that just watching her perform in certain moments kind of gives me the bends. I mean, she's just barks at tom-neal, shut up, and you sap, and all these lines that she just, spits out with extraordinary velocity. And in interviewing her, she says, that Ulmer tried to kind of get her to spit out her lines as if they came out of a shotgun, and she went hoarse in the process. And I think that that's definitely part of the extraordinary force, and again the part of the lasting power, the endurance of that film is her amazing performance.
Some of my favorite films noir have been based on books. I think almost all of my favorite ones have come from literature in some form or fashion. And Detour is the same. What can you kind of tell me about Martin M. Goldsmith and the book that it was based on? And then he wrote the screenplay for this as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then they had to, whittle it down. But yeah, he that was an unusual. So Martin M. Goldsmith, prior to publishing in 1939, publishing his slim pulp novel Detour, his only other writing credits were another pulp, which was his first, called Double Jeopardy, and then he'd also written a smattering of short stories that he'd published in Script and Cosmopolitan and other such magazines. Goldsmith had, this is kind of the wonderful backstory to this, is that on the eve of the Great Depression, he apparently thumbed his way cross-country from New York. And then while he was writing Detour, apparently he financed the writing of that pulp novel by loading a bunch of people in the back of his Buick station wagon and driving them cross-country at $25 a head from New York to Los Angeles. It's funny, when that book was published, the New York Times hailed it, and I love this line. It's one of my favorites. I'll never forget it. I can quote this any time. They called it a red-hot, fast-stepping little number. And it is, I don't know whether you spent any time with the little source novel, but it is, in 145 page, depending upon which edition you read, it really packs a punch. And in that novel, where he rotates, Martin Goldsmith, he rotates chapter by chapter from Al's story to Sue's story. And when he adapted it for the screen, we also had much more of Sue's story. And then when Ulmer, together with Martin Mooney, the associate producer on the picture, when they realized that, there's no way they could adopt this, I think it was 250-page screenplay or something that he'd written when trying to it in his own adaptation of the novel, they lopped off Sue's story, more or less. I think it's very fitting when you see Al calling, and you never get to hear her response. In a way that kind of tells it all, because Claudia Drake, who plays Sue in the picture, she has very, very little screen time and has very, very few lines of dialogue. And basically her many, many other lines and the complexity of her character kind of ended up on the proverbial, editing room floor. It was a strange choice to have Goldsmith adapt the novel himself, and I don't know whether that was just because it was done for PRC. There are other instances where you have the novelist adapting his or her own work for the screen, but it was really quite rare then, and it's, I think, equally rare today. But Goldsmith, he was kind of an old lefty, and he ended up in Mexico, and I think that he really felt that he never got the credit that he deserved for the novel, or the credit that he deserved for inspiring the film that Ulmer ultimately directed. As recent as I think it was the 1990s, and I quote from this in the BFI book, there was a letter to the editor, I think it was the Los Angeles Times, and I think it was from Goldsmith's widow, who was claiming that he'd never really been accorded the fame that he deserved. So Goldsmith, almost like an Ulmer figure, I think, is somebody who was overlooked, but it was enormously talented. And that little novel from 1939 is a very, very poignant and compelling story, and I think that Ulmer was drawn to it, in considerable measure due to Goldsmith's talent and to what he was able to get across on the page. Ulmer identified greatly with this figure Al. He was Alexander Roth in the novel. He was a Jewish. He was a violin player, and then he becomes Al Roberts, the pianist. But he was kind of again a frustrated musician, the novel kind of it luxuriates really in all sorts of sort of ambient, Jewish touches, and there's Yiddishisms and all that. And that, of course, wouldn't have been appropriate for the story, but I think that Ulmer, who was a very, very assimilated, identified himself as this Viennese Jew, even though he was born in the provinces, but cultivated and so forth, I think he still felt some attachment. There was some, if you like, tribal attachment, but I think that he also, so it was that combination perhaps of some sort of ethnic, if you like, or tribal identification, but also with this sort of frustrated artist, that down-and-out artist. And even at the end of his career, so as late as 1968, Ulmer tries to remake Detour. He files a screenplay with the Screenwriters Guild in 1968 under the title, alternates the title, either the Loner or the Loser, depending. The copy I have bears the title the Loner, but then it's penciled out and says the Loser. Either way, I think is very, very fitting. And very much fitting too when you think of Ulmer and almost a very, you might say, a sort of desperate move late in his career when he hasn't struck it big. 1968. This is just 4 years before he passes away from a violent stroke, September 30th, 1972, and he is trying to kind of somehow, Detour was the film with which he identified most deeply. And he tries to redo it. He sets it in the hippie culture of San Francisco, and it has a lot more sex in it, the screenplay. But Ulmer, he wasn't ready to let go of that. And there's another example of this too, which was the first picture that he ever directed, which is the one that he actually co-directed with Robert Siodmak. Still, in Europe, he went back to Berlin, and they make this wonderful, this really amazing silent picture from the Weimar era, a film that I teach all the time, which is called Menschen am Sonntag, People on Sunday. And late in his life, too, like the example I just gave you with Detour, he was in conversation with Luc Moulet and Bertrand Tavernier. They were among the first to interview Ulmer for Cahiers de Cinema in the 1950s, and then again in the 60s. And Ulmer wanted to remake People on Sunday, which was a film that uses, all amateurs, all non-actors. It has a very sort of naturalistic approach to filmmaking, no sets, all shot on location, natural lighting, the kind of, as you can imagine, something that would inspire then Italian neorealists, or as Ulmer liked to call it, his Rossellini style, and even, later the Danish filmmakers around Dogma 95. But Ulmer wanted late in life to approaches Luc Moulet and Bertrand Tavernier, and wants to remake People on Sunday with French actors. And so I think there's something very tragic about a career where when you think about it, when Ulmer reaches the tail end of his career, and the only thing that he can think of doing at that point is remaking some of the films that he continued to hold in high esteem and with which he continued to identify. You have that certainly in the case of Detour, and I think that People on Sunday is another example of that, a film that he continued to recognize as among his best, and as I said, to really hold in high esteem until his passing in 1972.
So why do you think that Detour was kind of, I know there's not a better word for this, or maybe there is, de-Jewified, going from book to film? And do you think that it was really done completely, or do you think that there are still touches in there that people can see if they're actually looking for them?
It's tricky. I've read this film, and I do so in the BFI book. There's this subsection called Allegories of Exile. And I do look at Al Roberts as this sort of displaced, uprooted figure, like a sort of refugee figure a la Ulmer and all these other refugees from Germany and Austro-Hungary, largely of Jewish extraction, even if they themselves really didn't necessarily identify as Jews. I think that you can see these sort of subterraneous or latent gestures or hints in the film. But as to your question about why it was de-Jewified, why it was stripped of those Jewish references that you have in Goldsmith's novel, I think that especially in it premieres the week of Thanksgiving, 1945. America's still sort of reeling, I think, from the Second World War. I don't think America was really ready for these sort of the kind of ethnic characters that you get much later. You know, whether these nebbishes in Woody Allen movies or I'm trying to think, when do we have a Gentleman's Agreement? You know, that was really quite revolutionary. I think it's a good few years later. I think it's maybe 48, if I'm not mistaken. But you know, I don't, and especially at a PRC, where arguably they could have gotten away with much more, and I think that explains some of Ann Savage's revolutionary, groundbreaking work as Vera. But even at PRC, I don't think that they were especially eager to tackle that. That would have been more of sort of a social issue picture. You know, I mentioned Gentleman's Agreement, but I just had done some work on William Wyler and you know, The Best Years of Our Lives, and that was you know, there's a great book that just came out by Mark Harris called Five Came Back, and when I was working on a piece, a review essay on that book, I went back and read a bunch of material on William Wyler, because I was especially interested in how it is that he came to direct Gentleman's Agreement, and Gentleman's Agreement, Best Years of Our Lives, and you know, depicting these returning vets so soon after the war, that was really radical, and they came up against all sorts of resistance, Wyler and company, in making that movie. And I think, and you know, there's no reference to any of the atrocities that occurred during the war. There's certainly no reference to anything Jewish or anyone Jewish in that film. But I think to include the numerous references, the sort of ambient Jewishness that you have in Goldsmith's novel, would really have been unthinkable. And Gentleman's Agreement, yeah, which I mentioned before, you know, which Elia Kazan directed, that was two years later. That's 47. And that was really radical to have someone like Gregory Peck, who can oppose as a sort of, you know, as a stealth Jew. That was really, really radical. It's 2 years later, and I don't know whether America was any more prepared to deal with it then than they would have been in 45. But that was just, I mean, of all the things that could have been cut from the novel, I think that was a very easy one to go, along with Sue's story, which is kind of sad, because the story of Sue in the novel is actually kind of amazing. It's, you know, it's really one of these great stories of naivete and the belief that you can make your way to Hollywood and become a star overnight, and you know, one of many shattered dreams. And it's told with a kind of unvarnished candor that you really don't find in many novels. I mean, I think of Bud Schulberg's What Makes Sammy Run, and you know, you have that really wonderfully delicious sort of critique of Hollywood, and sure, that's a terrific example. But Goldsmith's little, you know, pulp does, you know, kind of packs a punch like Schulberg's novel or Nathaniel West, Day of the Locust, and it has it, you know, it's just one of the many plot lines of that, whatever it is, 150-page taut little red hot fast-stepping little number that he published in 1939.
One thing that I really appreciated in your book was kind of tracing the importance of music in Ulmer's work. I mean, that's the thing that I was struck with immediately the first time that I saw Black Cat, and that's one of the really crucial points of Detour, is the way that music kind of triggers the flashbacks, and just that he is this piano player, formerly violinist. How do you kind of trace the way that music kind of evolved or tied together his body of work?
That's definitely one of the, if we think of these kind of recurrent aspects of Ulmer's work, one of those recurrent aspects, one of those things that I think we're going to look for a defining attribute of his work, would be that the heavy reliance on music, in particular classical music and classical scores. In the Detour, you have that wonderful scene where tom-neal couldn't play the piano, so he shot from his sort of hands up, and you do see his hands, but those are actually Erdodi's hands, Leo Erdodi, who composed the film. who composed the music for the film. That move when he's playing in the nightclub and he makes his way playing that frenetic kind of improv bit where he moves from Brahms to boogie woogie. That's a really wonderful moment in Ulmer's career, because he I think was somebody who clearly valued European classical, sort of high art and classical music, but also was very drawn to American culture and specifically to jazz. Unlike some of his German or Austrian compatriots, famously Theodor Adorno, really thought that jazz was soulless and scorned it and dismissed it. And Ulmer was actually kind of smitten with jazz, and in fact, as I mentioned in both the little BFI book as well as in the much more extensive discussion in the biography, he initially had Duke Ellington's Sophisticated Lady on the production budget for the film, and they were going to use Sophisticated Lady, and next to that was the sum of $2,000 that it would have cost them to use Sophisticated Lady. So when they no longer had the money for that, that's when you get the Tin Pan Alley number. I Can't Believe You're in Love with Me. I think that again it's a very telling moment, because Ulmer, who was throughout his career so invested in music, and really, it's the first love. His first love was music. He wanted to study music. He wanted to be a conductor. In the absence of that, often used a baton when he was on the set and would sort of conduct various scenes with that baton, a baton that, at least as family lore goes, was said to have once been handed down from Franz Liszt, the Hungarian composer. So it was a distant relative of Leo Erdődy's. But in any case, the use of that Tin Pan Alley number in Detour is an important feature, because the film is this is a movie that was so done on the cheap, and had they used Sophisticated Lady, would not at all have it would have been completely inconsonant, I think, with the otherwise impoverished production values, if you can even dignify the film with such a term. Just the extreme minimalism, the extraordinary number of continuity flaws and imperfection, and then had you had the sort of resonant sounds of Duke Ellington's Sophisticated Lady, I don't think it would have fit at all in the end. But the fact of the matter is, they wanted to lop $2,000 off the production budget, and they did so by including the Tin Pan Alley. I Can't Believe You're in Love with Me. But throughout his career, he was very invested in music, and it goes, at least in his American career, it goes from the Black Cat forward. And the Black Cat, which today is certainly known for, the first of whatever it is, I think it's some 7 or more films in which you have Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff played opposite of one another. It's also known for its extraordinary classical score, something that hadn't been done, and that in many ways, anticipates, Kubrick's 2001, or anticipates other lavish classical scores that come, decades later. And so Ulmer was somebody who was enamored of music, and Carnegie Hall, his great tribute that he wanted to just be sort of the tribute to that wonderful cultural shrine of New York City and of the world. He had to include that kind of corny fictional storyline, because that's what the producers demanded. But for him, it's really a showcase of these amazing virtuoso musicians and conductors playing in that resplendent setting of Carnegie Hall. And Ulmer had a real, I think, artistic stake in that picture, and also, again, just in terms of his own identification as somebody who really prized the greats of modern European classical music. This was a film that I think gave him the chance to work with these. Many of these people actually were friends of his as well. Fritz Reiner, for example, Ulmer's daughter, Ariane, her middle name is Carlotta, and it's named after Fritz Reiner's wife. And they were her godparents. So, I mean, he was very close with these European musicians, these refugees who were living in New York and then later in L.A. and so forth. And so, I think that was part of his world, and that identification again with high art and with music, I think, comes through in a lot of these films. Even, Jive Junction, a movie he makes for PRC, is all about that kind of pitting against the high art and the European culture, European music against jazz, and trying to find some sort of a balance, the same sort of drama that ensues in Carnegie Hall as well, and the fictional storyline that is of Carnegie Hall, of little Tony who wants to play big band, and his mom will have none of that and wants him to be this classical composer who will, of course, play Carnegie Hall, and he needs to sort of somehow navigate those two worlds in that film in Carnegie Hall. So Ulmer was definitely someone who was invested in music throughout his career and sought to include it as best as he could wherever possible. And so you see it, I think, in so many of his films. And in fact, I mean, there's certain compositions that crop up. Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, for example, that crop up in different films at critical moments, whether it's in From the Black Cat when they descend, so Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff descend into the gun turret, and you hear it playing there. Whether it's in you hear a few bars of the Unfinished Symphony as well in Jive Junction when the Dickie Moore learns the matinee idol who plays the lead in Jive Junction, when he learns that his father's been killed in the Second World War, you suddenly hear Unfinished Symphony, that Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, and there's certain pieces like that Ulmer would draw upon. I think again as a means of asserting his cultural heritage, but also I think as a means of using these resonant and evocative compositions as a means of bringing European culture, European music to the culture industry, to motion pictures. Something that he was not alone in this, but something that he felt very passionate about and felt that he had a stake in doing. Obviously, there are other directors who've done this as well, but I think that was one of his goals, and one of the things that I think that he pursued throughout much of his career was somehow balancing his European background, so highbrow European background, or at least that's the way that he often characterized it, with the more lowbrow in terms of whether it was jazz, whether it was sort of popular culture, and whether, of course, it was making movies.
Do you think that maybe that kind of tension between the highbrow and lowbrow is maybe why we continue to go back to Detour after all these years?
I think so. I mean, I do think that that's something that distinguishes the film. Yeah, among the other key attributes that I attempted to kind of point to earlier, but yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons we go back to Detour. I think it's one of the reasons we go back to Ulmer. Ulmer was not alone, and there were a number of other kind of European refugees who were working in Hollywood in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond, who I think brought something to the Hollywood dream factories. But Ulmer did this in a way, and I think this has to do with the fact, again, that he was often working outside of the studio system. He did this in a way where he perhaps had a bit more freedom to include the music and to include these kind of European touches where, that would be regarded as was the case of Uncle Carl Laemmle when he came back from his vacation and heard the music that Ulmer was including in the Black Cat. This is the sort of stuff that was regarded as box office poison. And other filmmakers who were working at the majors, I think, may have had a little bit more trouble incorporating some of those touches, some of those key aspects. And I think if you even Her Sister's Secret, which is a lovely melodrama, kind of a Douglas Sirk style weepy, that's just been restored by UCLA and that hopefully will be released in high quality DVD sometime in the next year or two. But in Her Sister's Secret too, you have all of this, again, the kind of that mix that we were talking about moments ago, this mix of sort of high culture, low culture, and this cast that's made up of a number of European actors, whether it's Felix Bizarre or I'm blanking on the other Viennese actor who plays Herr Leuchtag in Casablanca, but this large European cast, and Ulmer worked frequently with these refugee actors who were there in Hollywood, who were kind of facing a similar existential predicament as he was, namely that they were desperate for work. And he was able to capitalize on that because, he was desperate to get decent and talented actors onto his films. And so he was able to get some really wonderfully talented, former stage actors and even experienced, film actors, people who've acted in a number of films in Europe and then already on these shores. Her Sister's Secret is another film. We keep coming back to Detour, and it's very easy to understand why. But Her Sister's Secret, I think, has something like Detour, not so much in terms of style, but in terms of that mix, that blend of the European sort of high art aspirations and more of the kind of low, that not necessarily slumming. I hate to use that term, but there is a certain bottom feeder aspect to Detour, to the figures who populate that world. But even the studio where it was made, I mean, PRC was a bottom feeder studio. They would sift, sort of hunt around and look for a film that does well. When Billy Wilder came out with Double Indemnity and it did so well at the box office, they came out with Single Indemnity. and there are many other stories like that where they were just, they were hot dick for whatever they could get their hands on and capitalize on various trends, kind of like what people still do to this day in the industry. That's why I think we have so many damn sequels.
Ulmer, despite kind of being this outsider, he still managed to work very steadily, it seems, for almost 30 years inside Hollywood, outside, in Europe, all over the place. What was it that finally kind of put an end to his career? Well, it was really his health. I think Ulmer, and in fact, this is a great moment in the Bogdanovich interview that it's not transcribed. It was transcribed, it didn't make it into the printed text. But there's a moment at the end of that interview where he says to him, and I'm paraphrasing. I can pull up the biography, that galley proof here somewhere. But published interview with Bogdanovich ends with Ulmer's claim that he was looking for absolution for all the things I had to do for money's sake. In the actual recording and the printed typescript, however, Ulmer counters Bogdanovich's follow-up remark, which he says, "You made some good pictures," with one last burst of optimism. "I'm going to make some good pictures," he retorts. "I want kids around me, really." And then Ariane says that, up until the end, he always thought, even in the latter stages of his illness, he thought he was going to come back. He said, "They'll put me in a wheelchair and I'll work. I'll make good things. I'll work with young people. They'll help me." And then she goes, he was still dreaming. Not until the last 3-4 months of his life did he ever even contemplate that this was the end of the line. I think that had it not been for his health, he would have continued to fight on. But he had a number of early strokes. He had a stroke when they were working on the Cavern, and they were still in Yugoslavia, and then crossed over to the Italian side to Trieste to finish the film. He'd really suffered what appears to have been either a stroke or some form of a heart attack, and he had a number of that's 1964. Into the second half of the 60s, he had a number of strokes. When Bogdanovich interviews him in 1970, he'd already suffered from pretty serious strokes. So had it really not been for his health, I think he would have continued to try to work. And I think it's really, really clear when this is the passage that I read to you, that he thought that somehow he was going to manage, whether he had to be pushed around a wheelchair by young film students or who knows what. But he just he wasn't willing to quit. And I think that too explains some of those, adorned or embroidered memories that he relays to Peter Bogdanovich, and that he really wanted to prop up what at that point in time had to have been regarded as sort of a sagging career.
And here was his last chance. Bogdanovich at that point in time was interviewing all sorts of great directors, whether it was Hitchcock or Hawks or Ulmer for that matter, Fuller. I can't remember all the other. He interviewed so many directors, and here was Ulmer's chance to tell a good story and hope that would somehow earn him a place for posterity. And so the interview, in a way, is sort of his last will and testament. And what I attempt to do in the biography is to kind of complicate that to some degree and to try to tell, not to disregard that, but to add a few shades of gray and to add greater complexity to the life and career of Edgar-g-Ulmer.
Doodle-a-bop-bop, doodle-a-bop-bop. Your eyes, your eyes, your eyes, your eyes. Ba-doodle-a-bop-bop-bop, woot-da-doo-day. Your eyes so blue and your kisses too. And I never knew what they could do. I can't believe that you're in love with me. Shooby-dooby-shooby. You're telling everyone I know I'm on your mind each place you go. I can't believe that you're in love with me. Shooby-dooby-shooby. I have always placed you so far above me. Oh, I can't imagine that you love me. After all is said and done, to think that I'm the chosen one, I can't believe that you're in love with me. Your eyes, your eyes, your eyes, your eyes are blue, your kisses. I never knew.
Thanks to Noah-Isenberg for coming on to talk about the film, and you can get links over where you can find out more about him and his project over at our website, projection-booth.com. Now, gentlemen, we're talking about Edgar Ulmer in Detour, but as we keep on this road, I think we have another detour to talk about, and that would be the 1992 remake. So, Rich, did you get a chance to see that?
Yes, I did, and I never thought I was going to dislike a film as much as Gus Van Sant's Psycho, but Wade Williams' Detour, I hate more. It's an awful remake, although in researching it for this podcast, there are a few things for the rationale behind making it that I can have some respect for, but as a piece of cinematic work, boy, it was a tough slog.
I totally agree with you. It is what I guess someone had called the Gus Van Sant Psycho movie-oki, and I would say that I know what he's trying to do in here. Supposedly, I went and looked it up, and supposedly he was taking the original script and trying to make the film based on the original script and give you more of, the Sue story and some other stuff that was cut out and try to, like you were talking about some of the plot holes and gaps that is in the 45 film. And to me, there's several problems with it. And one of which is, first off, it's in color, which does a lot to make it look cheap. And the second is it's really hard to get people in the modern era to sound convincing when speaking in that sort of 1940s kind of dialogue. And I don't know why this is. We've seen people tackle Shakespeare and be able to do it well, and that's even a more archaic, language. But for some reason, having someone kind of talk in that same manner, and if you put the two early diner scenes up against each other, the lines up against each other, it just sounds corny and it sounds cheesy and it doesn't sound convincing when you hear someone almost 50 years later try to do the same thing.
Did you ever want to forget anything? Did you ever want to cut away a piece of your memory or blot it out? You can't, no matter how hard you try. You can change the scenery, but sooner or later you'll get a whiff of perfume where somebody will say a certain phrase or maybe hum something. Then you're licked again. I can't believe that you're in love with me. I used to love that song once. So did the customers back in the old Break of Dawn Club in New York.
That tune. Why was there always that rotten tune? Following me around, beating my head, never letting up. Did you ever want to forget anything? Did you ever want to cut away a piece of your memory or blot it out? You can't, no matter how hard you try. Careless. I used to love that tune once. So did the customers back at the old Break of Dawn Club in New York.
I think that's a great point. It's one of the reasons why period noirs in our contemporary landscape are really hard to pull off. So, for example, I'm a fan of Rian Johnson's Brick, which uses a lot of Dashiell Hammett's stylized language from the 1930s. And it works in that film for me because he draws an equivalency between the type of diction used by 1930s hard-boiled characters and the secret lingo of high school students. I think when we try to do it straight up as a direct parroting of an authentic language from a previous age, we lose some of the genuine gravitas and meaning of the words. And I think Shakespeare is in an interesting analogy, which I hadn't thought of before, but I would think about it this way. Unless you're really interpreting these lines the way we continue to interpret Shakespeare, if you just do Shakespeare kind of as blank verse without any real understanding for the feeling behind it, it would come off very corny as well. And part of what I think tends to happen with noir, which I find highly regrettable as a person who has really focused most of my career on films in the noir vein, is people think that you just have a saxophone play in the background, wear a fedora, do some low-key lighting, and spout off 1930s and 40s dialogue, and you have a noir. And they miss that there's something deeper in the soul of noir, that noir was an art form of the 1940s that came out of incredible societal dilemmas and disruptions. And when we try to say this language without understanding that the original film Detour was shot under World War II wartime restrictions for the film industry, and that we were having wounded vets coming home, and we were just finding out about the Holocaust for the first time, these words can be very hollow and sound gimmicky when in the original case they were really meant to speak the language of the time.
To me, it's sort of the difference between what I will call jazz and smooth jazz. And to me, smooth jazz isn't jazz. So,
good point. I'm with you there.
Yeah, there are very few films now that can kind of, I'm glad that you brought up Brick. That's definitely one of those, and that they buy into it completely in that movie. And I think that's one of the things that is missing when it comes to other films that try to ape this type of dialogue. The other one that came to my mind was the Hudsucker Proxy, and the way that they could use some of this 50s, 40s, 30s type of dialogue and delivery and everything, but I think they were playing it for laughs a little bit at times, but then not at others. You know, I'm thinking of like the Jennifer Jason Leigh kind of channeling some of the Katharine Hepburn type delivery, but then also Bruce Campbell with the "say what gives." I mean, that some of that is corny, but it's meant to be corny. But yeah, there are too many films where it's just like, oh God, this rings so hollow. And you would think that they would have learned their lesson. I mean, you can make great films noir without diving into that same pattern that they had in these earlier films. You can make, A Night Moves or some of these other like neo-noir films. I mean, they're making neo-noir today, and you don't have to ape that. You can use the same words, you can use the same tone, but you don't have to use that same delivery.
Well, but I think part of what's going on here, specifically in the 1992 remake of Detour, is specifically that you have a producer, Wade Williams, who is a well-known collector of films that have fallen out of copyright. And part of the rationale behind the film, the thing that I can forgive for why this film exists, is Detour, the 1945 Ulmer film, is a bit of a tragedy because it has fallen into the public domain, which means that most of us have really only seen this on shoddy DVD remakes or on YouTube. And that's really a tragedy because even if it's a low-budget film, in a 35 millimeter print, it would truly be even a better visual spectacle. And in one of the things I read in preparation for this podcast, Williams undertook a literal word-for-word adaptation of Goldsmith's script precisely to try to bring Detour back into copyright ownership, So he came up with this weird idea that if he did a shot-for-shot remake of the screenplay, he could start to re-own Detour because for a very personal reason is that Williams actually owns one of the last remaining 35 millimeter negatives of Detour, and he was hoping to actually produce new DVD copies off of his pristine 35 millimeter print. But in order to do that, he needed to reassert copyright. And so the 1992 remake is his desire to attempt to do that. But it really comes off in a very freaky way, especially to just let the audience know. He even went so far as to cast tom-neal Jr. as Al in this remake. And wow, if you want to, I mean, I'm not a good enough psychologist to kind of psychoanalyze Williams on this one, but wow, that's just weird.
It was really weird because he looks kind of like his dad, but not really enough at times. And it's just like, and he definitely doesn't have the same delivery. He doesn't have the same chops that tom-neal had when it came to the delivery of this dialogue, of the voiceover. And unfortunately, there are way too many times where I can hear the different like recording sessions when it came to the voiceovers where things just change so much in tone of the recording itself. It's like, whoa, hey, they must have waited a couple weeks in between these two things, between like this line of dialogue and this other one. You know, it wasn't necessarily a re-loop kind of thing. It was just like, here's this chunk that was recorded this time, and here's this other chunk that was recorded at this other time. And it just felt really kind of strange. And you're right, Rob, it was weird that it was color. It didn't really lend itself to that. And I actually had a harder time. I know that I was watching a VHS transfer of this, but I was having a harder time making out a lot of things in this color version than I did. Even that fog scene from the original Detour was easier to see than some of the nighttime shots in this remake of Detour.
Right, and that's part, Mike, of what I think is at the heart of the types of films that you champion on the projection booth, is the remake reminds me that when you come across an authentic piece of cinema, and I don't care whether it's shot for 14 days for less than $100,000 or a $200 million movie, a great film is something to just respect and love and revisit whenever you have an opportunity. And when you see odd remakes that only make you long more for the original, all that kept going through my head as I was watching the remake is the genius of Ulmer is not easy to duplicate. And I think the fog shots are a perfect example of that. And I think too few people recognize that the ability to actually properly light fog on a closed set is cinematographically difficult. We just think it's like, turn on the machines, just light it, let's do it. But this is part of the testament of the true genius of Ulmer, who used to work at UFA, who was friends with Robert Siodmak, Billy Wilder, who knew Fred Zinnemann, the cinematographer. This was a guy who knew technically what to do. And a film like Detour actually happens at the midpoint of his career. This isn't some happy accident of a first-time filmmaker just like, wow, look, I made a movie. This was the work of a fairly mature, hardworking person who was used to cranking out multiple films a year, but could do so with understanding the instrument he had at his hands. And that's why I spend a lot of my time when I'm debating Detour with people to get them to not think about this as a low-budget film, because this is more, to me, like great rock and roll music, that you can have all the greatest studios in the world, but it's about the singer and the song. And in a film like Detour, you have both. You have Ulmer and Goldsmith's script, and when they come together, the music that emanates from this film is priceless.
When you talk about this restaging and how the various things are added back in based on the original script, and this is where I was talking about it being weaker because he adds in all of this Sue stuff in there, the Sue subplot, and then there's also this reveal earlier than later in the original of the sick father who's dying. And I think that earlier reveal takes away the punch that when it is revealed later, it seems more serendipitous and it seems more, in Vera's head that this is, wow, look what I just stumbled upon, as opposed to it's brought up earlier, and then it is brought up again, and it just, to me, didn't have the same amount of weight.
Now, Rich, you read the script for this. It was reproduced in a scenario, or I can't remember which magazine it was, but how did that kind of compare versus this remake?
No, I mean, the remake is literally the original Martin-Goldsmith script because Williams was trying to reassert copyright. So he was actually not faithful to Ulmer's adaptation of the Goldsmith script. He was faithful to the script. What that really does mean is all of this additional Sue material, which was part of Goldsmith's original construction, make their reappearance. I kind of, throw my lot down with Ulmer. I really don't see how this film, let's just say the film, instead of being 67 minutes, is 90 minutes. I don't see how adding 23 more minutes of, say, a series of Sue subplots really would give this film any more energy. What Ulmer did is a masterclass in narrative economy, only filmed the essentials, and nothing that would take away from this film having relentless momentum. Everything was thrown out. And the remake shows you, as I think Rob so well described, shows you what would have happened even in the Ulmer original had he not chosen to make those cuts as well. And I would still want to argue that he wasn't just cutting these to the bone because he didn't have enough money to make the film. This is a guy who, if he could figure out how to make it for 67 minutes, if he wanted to, it could have been 90. But it wouldn't have added anything. And that's Ulmer, the storyteller, who in other films that I also urge people to watch more Ulmer films. TCM just had a night dedicated to him. And when you start to see him over and over again, this is a man who really understood storytelling. And I think that's the highest compliment you can frequently pay a director, is they understand how to give the audience an emotion and have us buy in to that. And the emotion of this film is Alan Vera. The Sue emotion is perfectly fine being off screen. It adds nothing.
Well, it doesn't help either that Sue, who's been recast as a brunette in here, we had very much that dichotomy of Sue being the pure blonde in the original versus the dark woman of Vera. In this one, she's a brunette, and in this one, she's not very nice at all. And I know that goes back to the original book and everything, and it goes back to that line I was talking about earlier with Sue just saying, okay, sorry, wedding's off, I'm going out to L.A., but in Al's mind, that was absolutely fine in some regard, and he is kind of idolizing her and talking about how great she is through the rest of the movie and on this quest to see her. And when we do get to see what Sue is really like in these LA scenes, she's a schemer. She's just maybe one step up from a Vera. So it's almost like he would be going from the frying pan into the fire if he actually did make it to see Sue. So I think it does make a lot of sense that she was just out of there. She needed to be this symbol for him, this unattainable goal for him. You don't want the audience sitting there going, oh man, I hope Al never reaches her because she is just a piece of work. And that's what she appears to be in this remake version. So Goldsmith, he did a good job of adapting his own work, and he would go on to do a whole lot of great writing and screenwriting and everything. I mean, he was the guy who has story credit for The Narrow Margin, which is one of my favorites, and even the remake of that. And again, talk about a good remake, going from the original Narrow Margin of 52 to the remake in 1990. I mean, you don't get better than Gene Hackman in some of these films. So, but this is, just absolutely one of those good remakes versus what Detour is doing, but he did a great job adapting, but Ulmer did the good job, had the smarts to cut out what didn't need to be there, as you said.
I feel kind of responsible. I mean, maybe if I hadn't said all those awful things, well, maybe this wouldn't have happened.
Nobody's fault. I was just tired and lost control of the car, that's all. Anyway, I'll be out of here on Friday.
Lance, I've been so worried since this happened. I haven't slept a wink.
Really, Sue?
Well, of course, silly.
Well, I'm sorry about the other evening. I suppose it was my fault. Sue, was I really that bad?
No. Well, you know I didn't mean those things. Well, I liked you from the very first time you came into the restaurant. In fact, I was kind of hoping you'd ask me out.
Really?
Really. And now I've gone and ruined it. I'm just not myself when I drink. And I certainly wouldn't want you to think that I go around accommodating every man that asks me out.
Oh, I'd never think that of you.
Well, and I think it also just goes to what makes noir so memorable. Noir, to me, is not a film form that is highly dependent on plot. There are just so many famous stories about how confusing noir films are. I mean, one of my favorite films out of the past, no matter how many times I watch it, there are a lot of narrative threads that are completely open and subject to interpretation. Noir, to me, is a film form of brutal fate. And that's what I think brought Ulmer, the German emigre working on the margins of Hollywood, to this material. I think, I tend to try to avoid autobiographical readings of films, but in this one, it feels almost inevitable that in many, many ways, the reason why I think this film lingers in the minds of so many people is that Al is speaking in many ways for Ulmer's journey in Hollywood himself. I still love the line we didn't talk about in the film that, Al is a kind of piano prodigy. And when Sue tells him,
"You're going to make Carnegie Hall yet, Al?"
Yeah, as a janitor. I'll make my debut in the basement.
And that's a kind of bitter line that I think only a filmmaker working on the margins of Hollywood would put in as a kind of sick in-joke of working at a studio like PRC probably did feel for Ulmer at times, like being a janitor in Carnegie Hall, when his friends like Robert Siodmak and Billy Wilder in this exact same period are doing films like Double Indemnity and The Killers. The part that just thrills me is that for a tenth of the budget that those two guys had, when he was sitting at the table with those guys, he could say, I'll up you one Detour. And it was a hell of an ante.
Well, he did make it to Carnegie Hall because in 3 years' time he would be making a movie called Carnegie Hall, but again, making it on the cheap. Unfortunately, that was kind of his fate, and I really do have to recommend the biography that Mr. Isenberg wrote about Ulmer because it is just an absolutely fascinating story, and there are those kind of autobiographical details that kind of work their way into his works. And what we're planning on doing is sometime in 2015 is we're going to do a episode on The Black Cat, which was kind of Ulmer's, in some sense of the word, it was his greatest moment and also his greatest failure afterwards, just what kind of went on in his personal life, which kind of condemned him into making these movies, these on-the-cheap movies. But again, you find so many great things about his films. He is one of the most interesting filmmakers that is out there. And even when you have kind of a quote-unquote clunker with some of his stuff, which I'm not saying that Detour is at all. I'm thinking of something like, The Wife of Monte Cristo or some of these films. I mean, those still are more interesting and more captivating than what you're going to see, 99% of the time if you go out and see something in the theater these days.
I think people get hung up way too much on budget. And especially in our modern era more than ever, it's like, well, how much money do they spend on that? And how are the effects and everything? And as I've talked about on many an episode, and go back and listen to our First Blood episode, one of my favorite films I've seen in the last 5 to 10 years was made on less than $100 in one guy's apartment. It doesn't matter how much money you spend on a movie. All it matters is how good the story is and how well they bring you into that world.
Yeah, and I think, Isenberg's book just does a tremendous job showing how history has ill-served Ulmer by calling him the king of the B picture, because Isenberg does a great reconstruction of his career prior to 1940, when in fact, he was working on major Hollywood films, when he was working in theater with major artistic talents like Max Reinhardt. And you get this sense of a person whose personal life had the same mysterious force of fate that befell Al in the film Detour, because really there's a whole nother fantasy version of Ulmer's life where he would be as famous as Billy Wilder and his contemporaries, except for some weird problems in his personal life and also certain elements of temperament that he could never quite resolve in his own life. But I think people should recognize that Ulmer might have worked in what is called a poverty row studio for most of his professional career, but make no mistake about it, he was an A-lister talent. We can't lose sight of that fact. And I agree with Rob, it's never the money. It is always the story.
You know, what we often find is that people are not working in poverty row in terms of money, but they're working in poverty in terms of ideas. And that's what I see most of the time in, you know, big budget film that comes down the pipe. And I'm not saying that it's part of our current era, because if you go back and you look at most of the stuff that Hollywood was putting out, maybe 30s, 40s, 50s, most of that stuff is forgettable entertainment. There's only a few films each year that, you know, we're still talking about 50, 60, and now 70 years on when you talk about something like Detour. Okay, we're going to take another break and play a preview for next week's show.
Just to let you know, I'm not selling anything. His name's Charlie.
Charlie.
Yeah, Charlie. That's his name, Charlie.
Really? Tell me about him.
He likes me. He likes me very much.
Your boyfriend, Charlie. He's a cop.
If I pull this trigger, nobody's going to call it murder. It's going to be law enforcement.
Wait, Charlie, don't do it. Not yet.
If I tell you where it is, what guarantee do I have that you won't drill me anyway?
We, the dead, welcome you. We, the dead, welcome.
I'm worried now. I don't like it out here. Well, let's move.
Not sure.
That's right. We'll be back next week with another chapter in our Noir November when we talk about Nicholas Ray's In a Lonely Place. We'll be joined by the Eastman House's Jared Case. Before we go, I want to thank this week's special guest co-host, Rich Edwards. Rich, last time you were on the show, it was 2 years ago, and we were talking about Shoot the Piano Player, where you talked about the book that you co-authored, The Maltese Touch of Evil. What have you been up to lately, sir?
Still collaborating from time to time with Shannon Clute, who's my partner in podcasting. We haven't produced any of our series out of the past for a while, but listeners of your show, if they want to just hear more discussions of noir-only films, they can go check out my podcast at Out of the Past, Investigating Film Noir. It's both at a website and at iTunes. Still looking into different films. I think what's always interesting to me is that a lot of my recent scholarship is looking a lot more at noir television, especially a show like Breaking Bad, which I think might be the most noir show in television history. So, you know, I always try to keep something going on in noir, both the classic noirs and all of the great artists still working in a film style that I just absolutely adore.
Well, thanks so much for coming on again, Rich, and thanks to everyone for listening to the show. If you want to repay the favor, head over to our website, projection-booth.com. Click over to iTunes, leave us some stars and feedback, and make sure to watch out, because that cold finger of fate could put the finger on you at any time.
At the end of the rainbow, there's happiness. And to find it, how often I've tried. But my life is a race, just a wild goose chase. And my dreams have all been denied. Why have I always been a failure? What can the reason be? I wonder if the world's to blame. I wonder if it could be me.
Yes. Fate, or some mysterious force, can put the finger on you or me for no good reason at all.
If you enjoy this show and want more people to know about it, head on over to iTunes, leave a comment, and rate it 5 stars. Make sure you like and share us on Facebook, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Just search for Christopher Media. Thank you in advance for supporting Christopher Media by clicking on the PayPal button and by clicking through to all the sponsors who support ChristopherMedia.net. Most importantly, we would like to take the time to extend an extra special thanks to you. Christopher Media could not exist without your support. Thank you for visiting ChristopherMedia.net, and thank you for listening. Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.